Good morning. I appreciate your guys' flexibility again. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you live yesterday for our collaborative planning meeting, but I hope that this will serve as, just kind of a walkthrough of what we would have done together, and then we can touch base on a one-on-one basis if you'd like to, or next Tuesday to kind of flesh this all out. Also, I'm recording this on Wednesday, November 10th, and just in case you haven't had time to check your email yet, but you're watching this video, in which case, thank you very much, kudos. I wanted to share some great news with you, which is that Thanksgiving break just got extended. Further details I'm sure will be coming out from Dr. Green soon about how that'll affect the Waverly schedule specifically, but you guys have certainly earned a well-deserved break to spend time with whomever you choose, doing whatever you'd like. So, as we kind of talked about last week, with this transition into Module 2, we got to think about cool, now what comes next? So what we're going to be focusing on during this next cycle of collaborative planning is how to really best meet your kids' needs. Linked in the description of this video is a handout. We're going to launch into this new cycle of learning, and we're going to think, beyond just the summative assessment. We're going to think about ways that we can collect and use informal data daily within your foundational skills lessons. So once you get your handout, you'll make a copy like this. Perfect. Okay. What I'd like you to do first is just take a couple minutes, pause the video, and think about how do you determine whether your students are on track to meet your unit goals, and also how and how often do you currently respond to data. Of course, we have aspirational and then reality. So, keeping ourselves in reality, how often are you actually currently within your practice able to respond to data? There is a space for you to write your response to. All right, so as we jump into a cycle, for those of you who I worked with last year, you may remember this kind of 8-week cycle format that we used at the end of last school year. But for all of you, I'll kind of review what a content cycle looks like. Clearly, it is cyclical. We'll start with shared learning, which is what we're doing now, where we engage in new content-specific learning aligned to a shared curriculum or topic. After that, we'll do some planning and practice. We'll apply that new learning to whatever you would already be doing with students. We're not adding anything new. We're not trying a whole new program or anything. Just whatever we've talked about, applying it to your already in progress lessons and curricula. And then look at student progress and reflect on the impact that your new teacher practices have had on student learning. And then, because it's a cycle, we do it all over again. We talk about how it went, we plan and practice again, and then we look at student progress. And maybe at some point we realize that, the student progress shows that we're able to have a new topic of shared learning for a new cycle. But for this cycle, we're going to be talking about collecting and using data daily. You can see here the kind of 8-week calendar for how this is going to look. Weeks 1 and 2 have been kind of collapsed into today. We're doing a shared learning where we come to a common understanding of what it is that we're talking about and thinking about, as well as do some goal setting related to the topic. Next week, we'll actually start the planning and practice portion where we plan and apply the learning to a lesson that is upcoming within the next week. The week after that, the week of Thanksgiving break actually, we'll look at some student work to see how whatever you planned, how did it go? What student outcomes can you identify? And then for the 3 weeks following that, kind of in between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we'll be doing a consultancy protocol where you guys will actually be helping one another kind of brainstorm and come up with some ideas and solutions connected to what you've realized through your planning and practice and through evaluating student progress. And then, unbelievably, in the new year, we'll do a little bit of reflection and see how the cycle went, and if we want to continue on with this same cycle around collecting and using data daily in the planning and delivery of small group instruction, or if we want to take another direction. So our objectives for the day, They're also on your handout. The first is to explain the rationale for daily data collection, and then also to plan to collect daily informal data. Begin today by doing a reading to ground ourselves in a common purpose for collecting data daily. You'll be able to find this handout on your handout. If you click right here, it'll open up the document. As you read, I just want you to think about these two questions. Number one, why might it be important to collect informal data daily? And number two, what are some tools and strategies for collecting informal data daily? So some of the things that came up as I was reading through that was that it's important to collect informal data daily to help you as a teacher identify gaps. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Identify gaps in student learning. It also helps you to provide timely feedback to your students, as well as correcting errors. It also helps you figure out what needs reteaching before you get to that summative assessment. What else? It ensures gaps don't grow. Hopefully we have some of the same things. It also helps, it would be helpful if I spell things correctly. It also helps with continuous progress monitoring. Man, how embarrassing. So these are just some examples of things that came up for me as I was reading that for why it might be important to collect informal data daily. It's also important to think about the fact that it helps you identify mastery, because it is mastery and not coverage that leads to automaticity. One of those things that, you feel like, cool, I've taught it, I've delivered it, I planned it well, I delivered it well, I've covered it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, students have mastered it, and they might not have developed that automaticity that we want students to be able to develop, especially with these foundational skills. Also, this last bullet point that I just jotted down, assessments are really going to help you determine whether instruction that you're giving is enough to help your students, all of your students, reach grade level expectation. All right, so now that we have a shared understanding of the basic purpose of collecting informal data daily, let's just take a minute to read a common scenario that is about to be up on the slide. As it comes up, I just want you to think about, it's also on your handout, but I just want you to think about how many of you guys have experienced something similar to what we're about to see. So, in this scenario, after giving a unit test, Ms. Drake discovers that over half of the class is struggling with, less than 50% mastery with all of the sound spelling patterns from the unit. And while there are opportunities to review those sound spelling patterns in upcoming units, she worries that students are going to need a significant amount of support and additional practice, and she isn't sure how she'll find enough time to address her students' needs. Thinking about the scenario and the reading that you guys just did, take some time and think about these two questions here. Number one, which students in Miss Drake's hypothetical class, or kind of generally, which students are impacted most if we don't collect and use data regularly? And then secondly, how might implementing the practice of collecting data regularly contribute to equitable experiences for students? You'll see the scenario is typed out here, and you can just jot down your responses here. As I was thinking about Ms. Drake's situation and also thinking about that reading, when I think about which students are impacted most if you don't collect and use data regularly, the group of students that comes to mind first is students who are struggling and or need that extra practice. And that's because their gaps can go unnoticed until the end, until the summative assessment. So they're not getting the support they need along the way. And then for how might implementing the practice of collecting data regularly, how might that contribute to equitable experiences? You know, I'm thinking about the fact that these summative or unit assessments may only happen every week or two. So hopefully we had kind of similar ideas. I'll be interested to check in next week and see if you had any other ideas for this situation with Ms. Drake. All right, so now that we've looked at kind of this totally hypothetical scenario of Ms. Drake, let's take a look at the methods for actually implementing daily informal data collection. All right, so what I'm wondering, and to show you where we are on the handout, we're moving down to this next section, daily informal data collection. I want you to think about what helps you decide what data you want to collect for a given lesson. So again, what helps you decide what data you want to collect for a given lesson? Is it things like the focus skills from the unit assessment? Is it skills that you previously taught that you know students struggled on in the unit assessment? Is it skills that are early in a unit that are foundational to the rest of the unit? What are some other things? So, I mean, there's a lot of data that you could collect about students and their progress, but what we don't want to do, both for you as the teacher, because as I always tell you, I'm just so glad that you're here, so thankful for you, and also for the sake of the students, is we don't want to over-collect and just feel overwhelmed and paralyzed by all of the data that we've collected. We want to be strategic in lessons about what data we're collecting and why we're collecting it. So what we're going to do for the rest of this collab is focus on how we might approach collecting that informal data. So in your handout, you'll see these same three, this same table. So the first one, these are just a set of guiding questions to support you in your process as you're trying to make these decisions about, you know, what data to collect, how to collect it, and what to prioritize, like who to collect data from. So, I mean, you can read through these. I'll read through them briefly. For the first one, you know, it's important to look over your curricular materials to pick out which parts of the lesson are going to be super valuable for collecting that informal data and helping you understand student progress towards proficient performance on all of the EOM task components. How you should collect the data. Again, this is going to be something where you need to look at your lesson to guide your decision making on whatever tool you use for data collection. This is going to vary probably from lesson type to lesson type, and for who you should prioritize. You know, you guys are already doing this as you're looking at data to make your small groups, but it's super important to just do a thorough job of determining which students you're going to prioritize based on, you know, previous data that you've collected. All right, so now we're going to look at our first practice of walking through these steps. So the unit introduction and test are useful resources to look at when you're trying to make the decision. And this can happen at the start of the unit or at any point throughout your planning. What you have in your handout is an excerpt from Unit 5, Level 2 in your handout, which you will see right here. So what I want you to do is just take a look at this lesson and think about what are the new concepts within this unit and how does this unit test assess progress towards these concepts. And you will see these first two questions right here. So as you look through the introduction, you will probably come across several things that stand out to you to answer this question. You can see here under new concepts, a great place to look. So we can actually just take a lot of those things and just copy and paste them right over. So here are the new concepts in the unit. And And then thinking about the second question, how does the unit test assess progress? We can go back and look at the test. So take some time, look at this test, and see how it assesses those concepts that we just said are new for this unit. We came up with the same answers. So for the test, these are some of the things that I noticed were how the unit test assessed students' progress towards those new concepts. So our next step, as you see both in your handout here where it says lesson, and also here, is to take some time to look at the first step in the process, reviewing those curricular resources to figure out which parts of the lesson are going to provide useful data on the student progress. So in the materials that were linked, you have the Level 2 Unit 5 Introduction, the Unit 5 Test and Answer Key, and the Week 2 Day 1 lesson. So what I want you to do is just pause the video and take a few minutes to look over the materials and think about the question that you see in your handout. So what are the data collection opportunities in this lesson, and which might you prioritize for data collection? All right, now we can come back and see if we have the same answers. So for the Week 2 Lesson 1 data collection opportunities, I saw kind of three main things, and those were the drill sounds. You can quickly collect data for review skills, if any of them are priorities for individual students. Of course, based on like what you already know about those students, you can monitor kind of their progress and do some maintenance monitoring before the end of module or the unit assessment. Also, when the students are practicing, you can monitor their procedure for spelling multisyllabic words with suffixes. And then also something that I know a lot of you guys have talked about, spelling and just monitoring students' spelling of those suffixes. When we look back at this question about priority, that is really going to depend on student needs, like where you see the greatest student needs, whether it's individually or for a small group or perhaps even for your whole class. That's where you'll kind of figure out which or like how many of these things to really prioritize. So these are just some examples of informal data collection methods and tools and how they could be useful. All right, so we're going to move on to the next step. I wanted to give you a minute to think about what kind of data students would be demonstrating and what tool would be most useful. So take a look back at the different components of that lesson and think about how would students demonstrate their progress and which tool or tools might you use in order to be able to collect that data. And since these were the skills that we really highlighted, think specifically about these skills. And we are in this how section now. So you guys, I'm sure will have a bunch of different ideas than I do, but these are just some examples of ideas that I wanted to share with you for how you could collect data about these skills within this lesson. So for drill sounds, students would be demonstrating previously taught skills, and a tool that you could use to collect that data is tally or checklist. Students would also be reading and spelling 2-syllable words and the procedure for spelling those words with more than one syllable, multisyllabic words. You could use anecdotal notes. And for spelling, they'd be demonstrating their ability to use new suffixes when spelling 2-syllable words and the procedure for spelling those words that are multisyllabic, and you could use a checklist for that. These are just some examples. I'm sure that you will have more ideas for this also. So for this third portion, I would love for you to take some time to jot down in this last section here for the practice who. We don't have really any specific data to inform us right now, but we're grounding our conversation in this lesson. So what are your thoughts on these two questions here? At which point in this lesson would you want to prioritize collecting data from all students? and why? And which portions of this lesson might you prioritize for individual or small group data collection, and why? So for drill sounds, my thinking was that, maybe select students just based on previous data, and if it suggested that they might need some extra monitoring to see their growth and progress in this area. The review time is really useful for maintenance, but it can also be a way to kind of check in on students who previously, showed needs in that area. So as you're going over the teach portion, you will probably want to collect data on the full class. Because there are checks for understanding included in the teach, it would be good to identify in advance which of those students you'd want to scoop the base of the word and circle the suffix to check for how students are actually applying the procedure. Of course, it's also possible to shift this practice for all the students, so they can copy the word themselves and show how they scooped it and circled it, but that would be kind of up to you based on what you already learned and deduced about your students with data. And for spelling, my thought was it probably full class, using just a checklist to monitor suffixes without it feeling super onerous and like a big task for you. So the final consideration here is who to collect data from. And there may be instances, of course, where collecting data from all the students is essential, to track progress for a particular concept for your entire class. But there are also, of course, going to be times when you're just collecting strategic data for a particular group of students in order to help inform your small group development and also individual student progress. So these are some questions to help kind of guide your thinking. We'll come back to these questions as you're considering student needs. Where have students excelled in the past and where have they struggled? What are those new concepts in the unit, which we just kind of went over, how to look at those and consider those? What data is going to inform student progress on the new concepts? And are there students that I might need to observe more closely based on new concepts and past performance? So now we are in this last section here. What I'd like you to do is respond to these two questions. My biggest takeaway from today's session is whatever, and one next step I will take in my own classroom is whatever. So what's, you're going to type this in here for your own record, but very important, once you complete these responses, you're going to copy and paste them into the attendance link here. So this is what your feedback form will look like. You'll type your name, and you'll just copy and paste your responses to these questions right here, your biggest takeaway and one next step. So just copy and paste these into these responses here. If you'd like to schedule a little check-in chat with me, you can, and then submit.